Well, the virus has now killed more than 100 people in China, and new cases have been confirmed around the world.
So you don't want to frighten the American public.
France and South Korea have also got evacuation plans.
But you need to prepare for and assume
strongly warning Americans to avoid all non-essential travel to China.
That this is going to be a real serious problem.
France, Australia, Canada, the US, Singapore, Cambodia, Vietnam, the list goes on.
Health officials are investigating more than 100 possible cases in the US.
Germany, a man has contracted the virus.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
Japan, where a bus driver contracted the virus.
Coronavirus has killed more than 100 people there and infected more than 4,500.
We have to prepare for the worst, always, because if you don't and the worst happens.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Live from Fort Defiance.
Well, the virus has now killed more than 100.
Federal Reserve. It is Thursday, the 16th of April, year of our Lord 2020. You're live in the War Room. You got Jack Maxey, Raheem Kassam, Jason Miller. The entire team is here, ready to go on the John Fredericks, America's Voice, John Fredericks Radio Network, americasvoice.news, the streaming service of the Trump Revolution. Now, Dish Channel 219 on Newsmax TV. Now in 70 million homes. Really want to give a hat tip to the Newsmax guys. The show, when done late at night, got the great B-roll on it. Yesterday, the interview with Josh Rogan. Amazing. Amazing. Also, FM 99.1, 103.9 in Chicago and throughout the world on G News, GTV, on IRS, Nexus.org, everywhere in English language and subtitled later in the day in Mandarin. Okay, our guest later is going to be Joe Norman from the great New England Institute of Complex Systems to talk about how we've done so far in slowing the spread, and most importantly, how you're going to open up the United States of America. Because after the jobs numbers today, the housing start numbers today, we got to get on with it, right?
Just quickly,
yeah.
You roll through that thing is very impressive on the thing, but I think what stands out to people there is that you're watching us back on Newsmax in the evenings and you're watching this show.
I go and critique it. I take my notes. I take my notes. I got to take my notes.
Yeah.
Because the AVN is in real time. By the way, a hat tip to the guys at America's Voice. Fantastic job on the Trump. They do the pregame, the postgame on the Trump press conferences, which are a whole different animal, the way he, and yesterday, and here's the thing about the mainstream media, and I don't want to get into, we're not a right media matters, but for the country and for this, what is actually happening, if you notice the massive news that's coming out of the last couple of days, number one, and I might be incorrect, but I do try to skim through and see what CNN and MSNBC are doing that. I don't think, and I don't remember CNN, anybody really having a detailed segment and really analytics on the AP report. I don't remember anybody doing anything on the Josh Rogan, right? I think Wolf might have interviewed him, but I don't remember anything. I think he's a contributor for
this morning. And just show you like how sad my life is. In the 5 o'clock hour, CNN did have I forget the woman's name who's doing the broadcast, but they had someone from Shanghai talking through the AP story.
Oh, fantastic!
And it got to pull it. I forgot to send the note to Greg in the War Room. But I mean, the only thing I could think is, wait, this bro is in Shanghai talking about the Wuhan lab and AP story. I'm like, man, this guy ain't getting out.
Yeah,
like,
they're going to get rolled up quickly.
But they did in the 5 a.m. hour this morning. CNN did talk about it.
But those are two big ones, two huge stories, and also the Fox News, not just the Josh Rogan, the cables from the State Department. More importantly, the most important news yesterday was John Roberts asked the question of the president about the 5 now, I guess, intelligence sources, et cetera, all coming together and saying, hey, it is the Wuhan. It's this Wuhan lab that they're really focused on this, and just crickets out of the mainstream media. They're losing the most important part of this narrative right now, obviously opening the country back up, but we are going to get through this. Now we're in an information and economic hot war with China, with the CCP. That is just kind of, they're like not even not covering it, not even putting out the kind of building blocks you need so that your audience can then start to understand the story later, right? It's pretty shocking to me.
Yeah,
no matter how much you hate Trump, right? And of course, the Trump campaign came out today, and it's pretty obvious. Biden, and we've said on the show for back in when we were doing an impeachment show, but I've said this now for years, Biden is by far the most compromised candidate when you come to China. And I've always said that China's going to be the big framing device for 2020. Now it's up and now, I mean, with this pandemic, they have to be held accountable. I mean, it's just absurd. He's by far the weakest candidate. I mean, he is totally compromised by Beijing. It's just obvious. Now, we got so much to go through today, so let's go through the order. Let's try to put some rational order in this. How do you guys want to roll through this?
Well, I think, since you just touched on it most recently, with the Trump Super PAC America's First is putting $10 million actually behind that advertising blitz on Beijing Biden. And that rang a little bit of a bell, Steve. Let's go and play where I think I heard this from last week.
We admire your movement, and we know that you're going to be with President Trump. You're economic nationalist, you're anti-CCP, that you're going to be supporting President Trump up in Michigan, up in Wisconsin, up in Pennsylvania, because the globalist Beijing Biden, who's bought and paid for, Beijing Biden, who's bought and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party, is not going to represent the Bernie movement. As you agree with that? You got 30 seconds, Steve. You agree with that? Because here's the thing, it's about Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders, 20% of Bernie Sanders guys are their old Robert Kuttner, labor, hardcore anti-CCP, right? They're not going to vote for a globalist who has a history of terrible trade deals, NAFTA and all this other stuff, but particularly has essentially kowtowed. He's part of the elite. He's not middle-class Joe. He's part of the elite. This is paint by numbers. This is not that sophisticated, right? Bernie's guys are not going to support that. You can't sell that in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania. You can't do it, and that's why I think the campaign, now it's pretty evident they're going to be. And $10 million in April, that's putting a lot of lead on the target.
And especially at a time when there are multiple stories out saying that Joe Biden's having a real tough time raising any money. They're literally broke. I think he has like $20 million, which in presidential terms, you can burn through that in a couple of minutes. I mean, that's just there's just no money. Which, by the way, where's Mike Bloomberg? I thought he was going to drop in $1 billion or $2 billion.
I think he is. His thing is coming. He's coming in those PACs in those states with his thing. We'll have to see where that
let all of his people go. They didn't keep him.
I thought he transferred him over to this thing that
he transferred some money over from his campaign.
We'll have to drill down to where
Bill
they are.
McGinley, our expert on this, he transferred money from his
campaign.
You
got Bloomberg's a slick one. You got to watch him.
Oh no, it was a total dine and dash. No, it was that was like that. Hey, I'll call you, and then you never call her back. But I do want to go to.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I do want to go to the John Roberts question, because yesterday, and we got a lot of really good feedback, hashtag War Room Pandemic. People really appreciated the timeline yesterday, how we broke that down on why these 6 days, and obviously it was much longer than this 6 days. The Chinese and the CCP knew about this going back to December, but that 6-day gap and how they sat on it during the phase 1 of the trade deal, the signing, how they sat on it during the Lunar New Year, how they kept a lot of it quiet, even closing down Hubei province into that following week when they were going to Davos. But here's Fox's John Roberts asking President Trump at the press conference, and from President Trump's response, he effectively confirms that everything John Roberts is saying is accurate.
Better. John, go ahead.
Mr. President, multiple sources are telling Fox News today that the United States government now has high confidence that while the coronavirus is a naturally occurring virus, it emanated from a virology lab in Wuhan, that because of lax safety protocols, an intern was infected, who later infected her boyfriend, and then went to the wet market in Wuhan, where it began to spread. Does that correspond with what you have heard from officials?
Well, I don't want to say that, John, but I will tell you more and more we're hearing the story, and we'll see. When you say multiple sources, now there's a case where you can use the word sources, but we are doing a very thorough examination of this horrible situation that happened. Go ahead, please.
In your many conversations with President Xi, Mr. President, did you ever discuss with him State Department concerns about lax safety protocols that had been reported to the State Department from the embassy in Beijing about that laboratory?
I don't want to discuss what I talked to him about the laboratory. I just don't want to discuss it. It's inappropriate, right?
Wow.
When the commander-in-chief says multiple sources, that's a tell, right?
I mean, we know how President Trump hates the fake sources, but he's like, well, in this case, they're accurate.
Yeah. Multiple in this case, right?
But this is absolutely remarkable for months. Absolutely months. Folks on this show, people have been calling in. Our star guests that we've had have been saying all roads lead back to the CCP and the cover-up, and the lab in Wuhan, and the mainstream media has mocked and ridiculed any Trump supporter, anyone calling this out, Raheem?
I'm pretty sure Zero Hedge got kicked off Twitter for that.
No, they did. I talked to the guys last night. They ticked and have not been put up. I mean,
Right.
he's infuriated.
Yeah.
The guys at Zero Hedge, a fantastic site. And look, they link to every now and again. They link to a few questionable, sources. I always tell people just check the sources. But I think they're the best Wall Street coverage of anything. They hit this on Twitter 2 months ago and were banned immediately and have never been let back in. Right? I talked to them last night when this thing came out. Remember, Gertz was on episode 1, talked about this. The Washington Post, the 2 days later, said that this is the crank conspiracy theory stuff. And here's why this is so bad. Because not only does it show that they were warned and talked about the lack procedures and how you had to be on top of these things, right? That they didn't take any remedies for that. Number 2, they clearly knew, right? They clearly knew immediately what had happened. The whole wet market story was a total lie and a total spin. And if you talk to the Chinese, and on Saturday I want to announce we're going to have Descent into Hell Part 2, Xi and the death sentence of Wuhan. It's going to be very subtle on Saturday. We're going to have people actually from Wuhan. We're going to have many Chinese. Yeah, I've been working on this with Chinese, American Chinese here. People are expatriates, and also people in through the firewall. So it's going to be you're going to see the agony of the people in Wuhan and what they think about Xi. But one of the things that the Chinese say that's very interesting, it shows that the CCP wanted to put the blame on the Chinese people. They wanted the blame to be on the habits of the Chinese people and make the Chinese people look uncivilized. That immediately they went to the wet market and they put the video out of the woman eating the bat. Remember, she's sucking the brains out of the bat soup. That was a CCP. But they had the whole propaganda thing because they knew 30 days beforehand when they got outed, they were all their propaganda campaign. The guy at the Global Times, I mean, he's saying today nothing happened. Hey, you're a hack, dude. You got to come. We're going to give you a timeline that you can now use in your hack tabloid, the Global Times.
And the irony here is the real peasants who run China are the CCP. I mean, Chairman Xi is one of those over the mountains and into the valleys, learn how to be a peasant guy from the Cultural Revolution. So
forced peasantry. His dad was an enforcer for Mao, but he got sent back to the. His story is a heroic story in one regard when they sent him back, and for 10 years he tried to get back in the CCP. I mean, the Cultural Revolution, all of that CCP hierarchy, all went through the Cultural Revolution, and so. But that also shows you about the CCP. They don't care. People have told me in China that if they lost 50 million people because of this, but could still take down the West. And I'm not saying they didn't do it as an act of commission, but once they knew this thing was Chernobyl, suppress it and let's see what happens. That if they lost 50 million people and took down the West, no big deal.
I thought one of the buried leads in this story was the motivation. And again, going back to the Josh Rogan interview we had. And I'll tell you, after Josh came on here and later in the day, he was getting hit on Twitter by a lot of mainstream media people. Again, Josh is a columnist for the Washington Post, but a lot of people were...
For coming on a show or writing the article?
For writing the article.
Yeah.
Like, whoa, Josh, you're way out over your skis
Yes.
here. How are you? It sounds like you're accusing the Chinese of, some kind of cover-up or a nefarious plot. But the buried lead in that Fox story, the whole reason, and again, they were doing this bat research, and these caves were like 1,000 miles away. They're bringing it to this lab in Wuhan because they wanted to compete with the U.S. They wanted to one-up the U.S. and show that they're the better virologists. They're the ones who can get to the bottom of these coronaviruses, the other, the SARS and all these different, the H1N1, or as Biden would say, N1H1 or whatever Biden says. But the Chinese, in their quest to try to one up the U.S. in the West, that's why but of course, they're lack safety standards. They didn't know what they're doing. And I thought that was a great point, actually, that Josh made when he was on our show, that the money that we sent to that lab, actually, if they properly used it, the whole point of that money was to make sure they were doing things safely. Clearly, they weren't.
Well, Adams' thing yesterday, the $3.5 billion to the World Health Organization, and then it's additional monies. We're still trying to do the accounting, find out how much the National Institute of Health and CDC have put into the P2 lab. And this P4 lab is kind of a United Nations thing. It's France and other people have put money in there. Okay, hashtag War Room Pandemic. For some of those, some of the hardcore Trumpers that thought we were spending too much time on CCP, now you understand. It all becomes revealed over time, folks. Just stay there, take that number 2 pencil and write it all down. We're going to return in a moment in the War Room with the posse.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
The first rule of the Fight Club is there is no Fight Club. The first rule of the War Room, no fighting in the War Room. Okay. Yesterday, people did, welcome back to the War Room, by the way, on Thursday, the 16th of April, year of our Lord 2020. The people loved they loved the fight yesterday, but they all were taking Jack Maxey's side. I noticed Jack Maxey is the voice of the people in the room, right?
He's certainly the voice of the anonymous accounts on Twitter. I'll give you that much.
Greg Manns is the best sock puppet that money can buy. I just want to put that out there.
Okay, well, let's go. I tell you what, we got Joe Norman from the New England Institute of Complex Systems, who was on like the first or second episode of the show. We want to bring Joe, and been in since then. I want to bring Joe on, but I want to play a clip, Joe, so that you can listen in, and then we're going to talk to you about it.
What you must be able to do is to have in place the capability of rapidly identifying by testing, getting someone who's infected out of the circulation, obviously taking care of it if they need medical help, if they can be handled at home, do contact tracing, do it in an efficient way where it means something, not contact tracing many, many, many days after an individual actually is exposed.
Dr. Fauci, you've talked a lot.
So that's Dr. Fauci last night talking about...
Once again, what has he just said? Somebody's got to decipher that for me. I can't understand the gobbledygook.
That is what's needed for the nation to safely reopen.
But what is his answer?
That's why we have Joe Norman on.
Okay, good, because I don't... Joe, I want to bring you in now. Joe Norman from the New England Institute of Complex Systems. Joe, you said, I think it's been 3 months ago or 120 episodes ago, that you need to take, in situations like this, you need to take draconian actions in complex systems early in order to avoid massive problems later. So I want you to give us an assessment. How do you think we've done as a country, how the administration done, how the governor's done in trying to, quote unquote, either slow the spread or crash the spread, or crash the virus? Okay, Joe, we're going to try and come back to Joe in a second. Thanks, Fish, for the heads up. By the way, Joe Norman just had a new baby, so maybe that's taking time away.
Let's go to this one other clip.
Yeah.
Dr. Fauci, if you're wondering where he was last night, he was not at the press conference in the Rose Garden. Actually, it's the first time I think Dr. Birx did not speak, correct?
Yes.
I think
she was there to speak.
She was there.
I think the president just kind of wrapped it up early, right? He says it's a little cold out here.
Yeah, it's a little chilly.
Chilly.
You know, he threw some lightning bolts, got some people, had the good China talk. But Dr. Fauci was on both CBS and ABC. We played a moment ago the ABC clip with David Muir. Here's the CBS clip with Nora O'Donnell.
Tracing. The absolute thing that you would need is to be able to respond and contain whatever rebound you get, so that you don't wind up in a situation where you have another escalation.
Do you envision then in the future, in terms of reopening the economy, that there'll be temperature checks at businesses, that there'll be fewer tables at restaurants? What will that new normal look like?
I mean, I absolutely would not be surprised if we did see in certain places that someone would take one of those very quick temperature checks, put in front of your forehead, and wind up determining if you're febrile or not, and keeping you out of whatever location you want to go into.
Is this going to be a romantic dinner? You're having a romantic dinner, and they come and they randomly.
That's why I said Vish's new side hustle is going to be a bouncer out in front of Cap Lounge or out in front of Union Pub checking people's temperature.
Are these the type of things you think that they're talking about internally, or is this Dr. Fauci once again doing just riffing?
So here is, look, and this is why I want to have. I'm glad to have Joe Norman on, because I think he's one of the smarter folks out there analyzing this. On one hand, everyone's getting ahead of kind of what's society going to look like. When can you go to the restaurants? When you can go to the movies? Where they can do to let you in? But I'm wondering, are we, but I don't hear anything on the metrics as far as here's what actually has to be done, what has worked, what still has to be done, who gets to be phased in and when. And so that's what I talked to Joe about. But the one other point, I'm wondering if we're overcomplicating this in a sense, is really because leaders is, guys, this is all about testing. This is all about antibody testing.
But I'm not so sure they're that on. I don't know if they're just parodying. Like I said, on the bank. Look, the bankers had a call with the president yesterday, and what everybody I know from Wall Street said, all they did was hammer about the testing. But as you know, the bankers are sheep. right? I mean, they're not leaders. They're followers. They're hearing this, and they don't want to be outside. They don't want to be criticized by the New York Times, and they don't want to be lit up on CNBC in the morning or in the CNN. So when that doesn't really mean anything. When the bankers, when the hedge fund guys saying, "Oh, you got to mass test," their opinions like anybody else's, right? And it's formed.
And they're having like serious problems with mass testing. I mean, even New York City, they have the capacity to do way more tests than they're doing every day. But the problem is, it's like what we've talked about a long time, is the PPEs. You eat up PPEs doing tests. So New York City finds themselves in the horrible situation of literally only testing sick people to this day.
And the CCP has, the Chinese Communist Party has the PPE. We got to face that. They vacuumed it up, and now one of the reasons we're not going hard on the CCP is because we are kind of supplicants of that, right? We're a tributary state. They've got control of it. I know people starting manufacturing plants.
Well, and they've also done something in the last few days. The Chinese Communist Party decided that for quality control purposes, they're going to inspect like 111 different items necessary to fight this. So they're slow walking.
But they did get criticism. Right, they did get criticism, and they don't want that kind of criticism. A lot of those guys were selling very shoddy goods. You saw the French TV and all that. Okay, let's go to Joe Norman. Joe Norman is from the New England Institute of Complex Systems. It's the house of Anti-Fragile and Black Swan, both. So, Joe, give us your assessment of how the administration's done and how the governors have done of actually trying to crush this virus.
So obviously, as you mentioned before, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you perfectly. And congratulations on the newborn. We thought you were called away for father duty.
Oh, thank you. No, not at the moment, although that could happen. So as you mentioned, our position has really been take these actions early and nip this thing in the bud. And unfortunately, a lot of the actions we took a long time to take, and the same actions at a later date are much less effective. So, if we lock down early, you're going to prevent a lot of that spread. We locked down a little late, so obviously places like New York City, you get those outbreaks. So we did, when President Trump shut down flights from China, that was very good. When he shut down flights from Europe, that was very good. Probably the right move would have been on the day that he shut down flights from China to shut down all international flights. I understand why that was politically difficult, but that would have been, in terms of both the public health and the economy, the right move. And it's easier for people to see that in retrospect. People had a hard time seeing that at the time. So that was very good. The month of February was a little rough in terms of kind of just pausing and stalling and not really doing much and letting things grow domestically. And also the lack of domestic travel restrictions has I think, put a damper on what could have been a stronger response.
Let me ask you, when you guys at New England Institute of Complex Systems look at metrics, we keep harping that we think it's very important for Dr. Birx and Dr. Fauci to come forward with a model that they're looking at, the metrics that they tell the president, et cetera, because it's just too generalized right now, right? The policymakers can talk generally. The president sets overall strategy and gives leadership and guidance for direction. But we're very concerned. We have it, we're dealing off the University of Washington and these other models that are out there. They're all fine in and of themselves, but you don't really have what the metrics are, the algorithm, the assumptions, what they're really looking at the administration. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you have a great point that we should basically open source all of the models that people are using to advise on policy. I wouldn't want to reduce it to a single model. I think looking across several models is the right approach. I mean, you see that, for instance, in hurricane modeling. You don't just look at one model. You look at an ensemble of models. And frankly, in general, you get a sense of what these models are saying, not by some formal algorithm or something, but just by human beings looking across the different models, comparing the outcomes that the models are predicting, and looking essentially at the assumptions that lead to those outcomes. And the right thing to do is to make those assumptions very explicit and to call them into question when they don't make sense or they don't match the observations, and to see maybe our assumptions are wrong. So I wouldn't want to reduce it to one model, but I would want to open source all of the models that are being used to advise.
Joe, this is Jason Miller. But help me put a little bit finer. Yeah, but help me put a finer point on this, because let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. And I agree with you that there shouldn't just be the one model, but I do think there need to be certain benchmarks or certain goals that we're aiming for that we then socialize with the American public, so they then understand when someone's either when they're in a red zone or they're hot or we got to keep it locked down, or whether it's in yellow and we can start easing up, or green when we get normal-ish behavior. The only number that I've ever seen, and push back, Joe, if you see something different, as far as when things really can start to open up, is Dr. Chris Murray at the IHME, and by no means am I saying he's the gospel, but I'm saying this is a number put out there, is when we get to the 0.3 deaths per million, or in the adult U.S. adult population, that comes out to be 60 deaths a day due to COVID-19, that's when we can start to ease up on things. I'm not a numbers guy at that level. I don't understand why he picked that number, but what types of numbers would you be looking at to say, okay, now we can start to ease things up, or what types of benchmarks should we be looking for?
I would actually refocus the metrics on the infrastructure itself. So looking directly at ICUs, how many beds are open, how far is the overrun past their normal capacity, are those trending up or down? Just because there's so much uncertainty in terms of the actual numbers of sick, even of deaths and what the cause of death is, I would actually look at the infrastructure itself and let that be the guide to are things working? Are they getting better? Are they getting worse?
Hey, Joe,
there's a lot of sort of academic focus on,
Can we ask you to stay over for the next segment? We want to talk about the open. We want to finish this and talk to you about the open, but we got to take a break to sell some ads here to get some cash to make sure that we can continue the show. Okay, we're going to take a short commercial break. Hashtag War Room Pandemic. Let us know what you think of Joe Norman and the guys at the New England Institute of Complex Systems. We're going to return with the War Room and Joe Norman in 1 second.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
Welcome back to the War Room. We got Joe Norman on from the place that has generated the ideas of anti-fragile, which the Trump movement, we try to be anti-fragile, and Black Swan. So, Joe, knowing what your assessment is, how do you think we've done, and where do we stand? Given the metrics you look at the infrastructure and capacity utilization thereof, where do you think we stand? How we've done the job, and are we ready to reopen?
We've done a lot, and I think that should be appreciated, that everybody has sacrificed a lot in order for us to slow the spread. And I think that it's been effective. I don't know if it's been effective enough is the truth. And we'll see that over the coming days, whether we've been effective enough. Are we ready to reopen? That depends on how we reopen. Obviously, the country is big, and so some areas are hit hard, like New York City, and some areas are hardly hit at all. And so you mentioned before red, yellow, green zones. We need to start thinking that way spatially. And that's going to mean that if we want to start reopening, we should reopen spatially as well. But we're going to need to restrict travel from so-called red zones where there's a lot of infections, so we can keep this thing contained to those areas while they handle those problems.
So you believe you're buying off on that? The presidents and the staff over the White House has got this concept of by county, and you've got the red zone, you got the bad counties, you got the counties that are okay, and then you got the free counties, right? And I think they're saying 2/3 of the free counties in the country look like they're okay. So on that spatial, and then they take it to quadrants, right? You're saying, hey, you don't know if it's totally correct, but directionally, that's where you would go also, some sort of spatial opening.
Yeah, and I was really happy and excited to see when they announced that they were doing that. But to your point, we need more feedback. We need, for instance, a map that shows those counties by color. Moreover, we need to restrict travel from the red zones. Otherwise, the green zones become red zones again. So I don't know if we have the political will to do that, frankly, but I'm hoping that we do, because that will be a way to start opening up the economy. Another big one that, unfortunately, pretty much all of the institutions had exactly the wrong way in the beginning of this thing is masks. everyone should be wearing masks, especially, obviously if you're out in the middle of the forest, you don't need a mask. There's no one there. But if you're in any kind of grocery store, any kind of environment where you're with a decent number of other people and breathing, this is essentially what we're more confident about now. This is a respiratory disease. That's how it transmits. So masks for all, that's a sort of hashtag movement that's out there. I am all for that. That will allow us to open up the economy in a much bigger way if we get essentially universal mask using.
And Joe, I want to take, so part of our 30 Days to Save America plan that we were hyping up before President Trump added on this additional 30-day extension, you listed the first two, which are stopping the non-essential air and rail travel, particularly as it comes to hotspots. You talked about requiring masks in public, which we believe at the national level, so we're completely on the same page there. A couple other things I want to throw at you. What do you think about there hasn't been a national shelter in place. There's still the 8 or 9 states have not gone to that. Of course, South Dakota's in the news in a big way because of the Smithfield plan.
Oops.
What do you think about a national shelter in place or even this expanded use of therapeutics as well as mass testing, particularly antibodies, as being critical to any sort of reopening?
Well, I'm very sympathetic to President Trump not wanting to order a national shelter in place so that governors can look at their own situations and adjust accordingly. I mean, that's one of the great strengths of this nation is the decentralized political structure. That being said, one of the challenges with that is if we're not going to either quarantine on arrival from out-of-state travelers or otherwise do domestic travel restrictions, then that presents a real problem when you're not all in sync at the national scale. So there's a bit of a tension there between a decentralized response is great, but you need to have enough sovereignty at the local level to actually be able to mitigate and stop importing new cases. So there's a trade-off there. I'm in general much more sympathetic to decentralization than centralized responses. At the same time, if we're not able to do what we need to do at those local levels, then it needs to scale up to the national. So I think it needs to go either one way or the other. We either get a national lockdown or start a new normal at the state and county level of, hey, there's some friction here to travel. Either there's general restrictions or there's quarantines upon entry, which we've seen in some places. Those are the kinds of things we need to do to have an effective decentralized response. As far as mass testing,
go ahead.
Yeah, mass testing is obviously everyone's saying we need this. I agree, we need this. One of the questions still is who and when do you test when you have mass testing? For that spatial strategy we were talking about, what we really need to do is test in a massive way where we believe there is no outbreak, where there is no problem. We need to have confidence that that's true. And to continue to monitor that's true for those places that are green zones or really don't have any outbreaks. I think right now most of the testing is being focused in places like New York City, where obviously you want to get a handle on what's going on, but we already know there's an outbreak there. So you're actually gaining less information when you test in New York City, say, than a county in the middle of New Hampshire where you don't know really what's going on.
Joe, of the one more question, I'll quit hogging all the time here, but I want to get into kind of the metrics and the numbers as far as to the extent we've been able to track what has been effective. So I saw, for example, you tweeted out any part of a reopening should be mask for all. There should be maintaining no large scale events. I think you said on Twitter 50, maybe you said 25. I was looking at it yesterday, but you listed out several things. Or have we been able to quantify yet to what percentage or what's most important of these, whether it be social distancing or the masks or the no mass gatherings or closing down travel or international travel? Have there been any numbers that have put behind what the biggest force multipliers are of these measures?
I think that, frankly, you can make attempts, and people are, and looking at it, but we're not going to really have a handle on quantification until after most of this has kind of gone by. And so we have to work a little differently working into an uncertain future. And we know logically that certain interventions will help, like social distancing, like masks. That's a logical position. We all rely on germ theory, which is the idea that people get sick by these little microscopic germs. And so masks become an obvious outflow of that understanding rather than needing quantification on it. So instead of trying to quantify what is the single most effective thing, it's better for us to continue to layer things. And that reduction, 30% for masks, 30% for social distancing, as you stack those, you get a really large mitigation effect, even if any of those alone are not that effective on their own. So it's the quantification. I understand the desire for it, but it's a little more challenging sort of in the fog of war to get a handle on reliable numbers. And there's so many other interacting variables. I mean, whether you wear masks or not is one variable that interacts with cultural variables. How close do people tend to be anyway? How much do people touch one another? I mean, part of the reason we probably saw the effect in Italy that we did is it's a culture of closeness. So you have so many interacting variables that the desire to quantify in an absolute way is much more challenging than
this okay, a couple of things. This shows the immaturity of a lot of the mainstream media because they're just up there regurgitating. It's got to be evidence based. It's got to be. We understand that. You have to have a model. You have to have data that goes in, new information, your assumptions, all that. But the evidence base, it's all the fog of war too. It's not going to be that precise. You've got to make decisions on very imperfect information, and you have to do it in a very imperfect way. You try to make it as best as possible. Before we go, a couple of things. Is Texas? I'm going to throw out a random state. Texas. Do you think if you had to go spatially and you had to go geographically, what a state like? And understand it's not just on state boundaries where this is, but the president's made a decision on federalism. It's been done by the governors. Would you say if something was going to be first up, right, and kind of take the leadership, would a state like Texas, in your assessment, be one of the logical first ones to go?
Well, Texas, one of the things that Texas has going for it is even in urban areas of Texas, it's a lot of driving. It's not much public transport. So you have a natural social distancing in a place like Texas that will allow it to be a bit more open than places like New York City where everyone's all packed in together and there's no real way to avoid one another. So I think Texas would be a good candidate for that. And if they were going to try any kind of general opening within the state, I would strongly, strongly encourage some kind of quarantine on entry policy. And then we can get a sense of how effective
quarantine. Quarantine. Hang on. If I'm in Oklahoma and I cross state lines, you mean coming down on what I-35, what it is? The Texas Rangers are going to sit there and say, "You're coming from Oklahoma. You got to do a if I come in from New York City, I got to do a 14-day quarantine." Cross state line.
I don't see any other way as long as the hotspots are connected.
Well, hold on. I just want to make sure because I think you guys, I call them the pros from Dover. Are you telling me that you think in this unlocking, in this reopening, we've got to go to some state by state quarantine where the governor's got the decisions of quarantine and maybe they can pick the states like Oklahoma's okay, but if you're from New York or if you're from Seattle, Washington or Miami or Chicago or Detroit, you've got to quarantine for X amount of days. Is that's the recommendation
exactly right.
You would give the president?
Right. Yes.
And Joe, this is Jack Maxey. I'm injecting a little bit. I said this 3 months ago that 2 months ago, this is what was going to happen. You're seeing it in the Outer Banks. The local officials are taking control of who's coming in, who's coming out. In 1918, there's a great parallel. The county of Gunnison, Colorado, quarantined the entire county. Anybody arriving by car, horse, or train was forced to quarantine or not get out of the vehicle. And it's the only county in the entire country that did not have a case in 1918. So, there is some logic behind it if we're looking for a historical parallel.
That's pretty. So, Joe, we know what our headline is going to be out of the show today. Real quickly, because you got to go. Two things, and I want to go back to the Nassim Taleb's two amazing books. Everybody's on CNBC and the business channels every day saying black swan, black swan, black swan. Was this pandemic a black swan or a white swan?
Well, you have Nassim out there saying it. It's absolutely a white swan. I mean, us, as colleagues, we've been talking about this for years and years, and that's part of the reason we were so sensitive to it when it popped up. It is absolutely a white swan. It is coming out of our hyperconnectivity globally, and if we don't, right now we're on a bit of a global decoupling. Once we reconnect, we're set up for another one.
Real quickly about anti-fragile. After Trump won so unexpectedly on November 8th of 2016, or November 9th, however you call it, Nassim Taleb was interviewed and said, hey, the Trump movement is kind of an anti-fragile. Do you believe the United States, what was the United States and our culture and our civilization through this pandemic, have we shown that we're fragile or anti-fragile as a society?
I think that remains to be seen, honestly. We clearly have fragilities that are being exposed. Whether or not we are anti-fragile will depend on whether we so-called overcompensate for an event like this and set up for not only this event, but potentially a larger, worse event and other kinds of events, and not sort of overfit to this. So if we are able to maintain a more decentralized supply chain structure globally, have a lot more redundancy in our economy, then we will show ourselves to be anti-fragile. If we try to get back to the way things were and just sort of return to the familiar, then we'll show ourselves to be fragile.
Joe, we got to bounce. Fabulous. We love having you on the show. You're a big audience favorite. Keep grinding. New England Institute of Complex Systems here on the
Thanks, guys.
The network of the anti-fragile War Room Pandemic. Jack Maxey, Iron Ships and Wooden Men. Be back in a moment.
War Room Pandemic with Stephen K. Bannon.
The epidemic is a demon, and we cannot let this demon hide.
War Room Pandemic. Here's your host, Stephen K. Bannon.
President Trump says nothing is inevitable, and through human action, human agency, the United States of America is going to get through this. We just had Joe Norman. Let's go through that. By the way, I know Joe's a major guest because Jack's got a cough, right? I know it's a subtextual thing you're doing. It's a Freudian thing you're doing. Just tell us if you need more airtime because you're fans on hashtag.
It's a rating system. It's like the Washington Post Pinocchios.
You only got one cough.
We got one Jack cough.
It's my signal to the CCP drones out there to start
scrambling the
support.
The Wu Mal 50 Cent crowd can now go. The bots can start.
Do you think after Dr. Fauci is done with this coronavirus stuff, he can figure out Jack's immune system and see why?
Hey, listen, I have the worst immune system on planet Earth. I've caught every virus available. I survived them all.
Instead of
breathe the other way, Jack.
Instead of the 6 feet separation, he's got the 6 inches now. Why is Joe Norman not there, at least as Dr. Fauci's deputy? Right? Because here's a guy that walks through with logic, and some of the logic is pretty harsh about the testing, about the temperature, but particularly, I hadn't seen that in his Twitter feed. Is this the first time he's really come up and said, hey, we have to have this, basically at the state border, the governor's got to make the call what states get in and what states you got to quarantine?
Well, look, I loved having Joe on because he's a numbers guy, and sometimes you need a numbers guy to come back at you and say, on this particular question, there's not a numbers answer. Like there are just too many variables, or you're trying to solve for the wrong variable in getting to the metric. Now, the one thing, if we had a little bit more time, when he talked about the infrastructure strains, that was we chunk things out in 3 parts. One, what has been effective so far. He's largely saying that we're going to have to go back later on and kind of find this out, but we know certain things are working to stay in place, particularly the mask. What we want to see is now there's going to need to be this system where we, whether it's a green, yellow, red, or however we chunk out metro areas or quadrants. I don't think it's going to be state by state because you take in New York, which obviously impacts 3 or 4 states. You take a number of these different cities that cross over. Even take like a Pensacola, which goes, you got, Alabama and Florida, you got a big dynamic. But we're going to have to chunk out these metro areas. In Texas, for example, an Amarillo scale than a Houston. So we're going to need to have some kind of quantification there on the infrastructure, but then going forward. And this was the thing that you will need to put some kind of numbers behind because even Joe in his Twitter was saying the mass groups, keeping those, whether it's 50 or less or 25 and less. I do want to see, but the type of thing that Joe is talking about, whether it being saying you can't solve for it or you can solve for it, these are the types of smart thinkers that I want to make sure that are in there helping the president and laying this thing out because we all want to open as soon as possible. possible in the safest way possible. And we realize it is not a one-shoe-fits-all as we go into the reopening. We had to do the hard lockdown. We had to. This thing was going way out of control. But now as we start to open up, some places are going to be able to go faster than others. How do we measure that? How do we socialize it to get everybody on board, to make sure that the media knows this is safe? Because people need to keep this in mind. These blue state governors and blue state mayors and sleepy Joe Biden are going to take every little thing that President Trump does and try to make it as some sort of negative.
We also have to, and I want to go through this. This is why you have to have a national conversation. And I think what they have to do is put forward. Let's go specifically. We know, and I'm going to go through the punch list of what we need to do to reopen. Part of that we know is to some sort of specialty technique about sequestering the high morbidity, either certain minority communities, right, where it's dense population, or the nursing homes. Let's take the nursing homes. The difference between New Jersey, and I think Phil Murphy's doing a really good job. I worked with Phil at Goldman, super guy, right, although liberal Democratic governor. But the difference between New Jersey nursing homes and Florida nursing homes. And that's why, tell them what the difference is and why we now have to have a conversation so heads are not blowing up when the president does this.
I hope that this is not political in its basis, but what you're seeing is in a lot of these conservative states, particularly Florida, and there's plenty of interviews. I can read the statements of the doctors down there. They are doing a combination of all the antivirals down in Florida. They are doing the hydroxychloroquine, the azithromycin. There's now an old age home in Florida that is openly saying that we're giving them the ivermectin too. And the doctor was being interviewed, and he said, look, the key is you got to get them on this stuff early. And he said, if they're on it early enough, I get 100% recovery rate. None of these people end up having to be in the ICUs. And now I'm even been in discussions with a doctor up in New Rochelle, and because of the FDA guidelines saying that should only be given to the most severe patients, they weren't giving it to people until they were intubated. Well, I spoke to him last Friday. He said, we're giving it to them now as they walk in the door.
Bingo. That has to get on the table now because, the mainstream media is going to go nuts on this. And let's compare it to New Jersey. One of the stories that's buried the most that I think we're going to have a national conversation is these 17 bodies they found in a storage room, because the stories don't even address what care were those folks getting during the time. How did it just appear they had 17 in a old age home morgue that I think could take 2 or 3 bodies? They had 17 just stacked up, and there's no follow on. But hey, how did these people died of the virus? But how were they? How was it noticed? How the family notified? What treatment did they get, etc. My point is that's where you're seeing it like that's out of control, right? Well, and you look in Florida where you thought it was going to be devastated, and it's not. And why is that? Because and that's one of the mass on point things you have to have. You have to have therapeutics, and the progressives are going to go nuts because President Trump's been out front on the therapeutics, right? And they're just going to go crazy about it. That's where we have to have, hey, this is about the country and about saving lives.
And you've seen this sort of odd drift towards a totalitarian kind of perspective with the governor of Nevada, the governor of Michigan, who they now apparently are trying to have a recall on. When reality is, and this is the history of medicine.
10 of you guys show up on a state thing. Now they're trying to have a recall.
And Steve, you were brilliant about this when you said it on Maria Bartiromo. All of this, every aspect of the treatment of this disease should be between the doctor and the patient. 100%. The governor should stay out of it. Everybody should stay out of it and let the doctors decide what the best treatment regime is.
Buried lead on that, the 17 bodies found in New Jersey at this rest and retirement home. The 17 were among 68 recent deaths linked to the long-term care facility. Hey, guys, it wasn't just that they found 17 bodies stacked back there. They've had 68. And look, only
not just that, the infections are out of control. There's still hundreds of infections.
I mean, how is this place even still open?
I'm saying the state or somebody's got to be all over that.
They're going to die anyway.
This is the Jack.
No.
Come on, Jack.
No.
Listen, you're going to have individual rest homes that are horrible. I mean, one of the things that I'm
doesn't have to be.
One of the things that I'm very proud about that we did with this thing starting early on. Remember that Rest Home Association on the 14th of February, and they called us up and said it was only because of your show. They brought in over 200 rest homes. They brought in Harvard professors, and they defined how.
Short break. We'll be back with the second hour in just a moment.